They laughed behind the black caterer's back, mocked his uniform, and dismissed him without a second thought. The guests, comfortable in their world of wealth and privilege, saw only the surface. Malcolm Turner, in his pristine white shirt, black vest, and perfectly polished shoes, moving through the crowd with trays of golden hors d'oeuvres and crystal flutes filled to the brim. To them, he was just another servant, part of the invisible machinery that made their celebration possible, but hardly worth noticing. The champagne flowed freely, the laughter was loud and carefree, and the guests exchanged jokes at the expense of anyone they deemed beneath them, Malcolm being the prime target. But minutes later, the truth he had been hiding, quietly and steadily, would leave the entire wedding crowd speechless. The moment he set down his tray on the high table near the champagne fountain, everything changed. It wasn't the sound of music or the clink of silverware that shifted the atmosphere. It was the subtle, undeniable presence of Malcolm Turner. The sprawling estate, nestled under the fading light of the late afternoon sun, shimmered as a tapestry of white linen tents, polished silverware, and manicured gardens that stretched for acres. Waiters in starched uniforms moved like white ghosts, their bodies gliding silently through the crowd, unnoticed by the guests who were far too absorbed in their own self-importance. But among them, Malcolm moved with a kind of quiet precision that set him apart. He was more than just another staff member. His presence was something the others couldn't quite place, though they would certainly sense it as the day wore on. As he passed through the guests, balancing trays with the ease of someone who had spent years perfecting the delicate art of catering, his movements were fluid, almost too graceful for the role they had imagined for him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with deep brown skin and a calm, steady gaze, Malcolm was a man who didn't fit the mold they had placed him in. At first, the wealthy guests barely noticed him. He blended seamlessly into the crowd of waiters, all wearing the same uniform, all moving silently through the reception. But it didn't take long before the cracks in their carefully constructed facade began to appear. The first remark was whispered too loudly between two women in pastel dresses, dripping with diamonds, clutching their champagne flutes. "At least he knows how to carry a tray. That's more than I can say for the last one," one of them said, her voice dripping with condescension. The laughter that followed was sharp, dismissive, and cold. A man in an expensive navy suit chuckled under his breath. "Well, they're good with their hands, aren't they?" Another man, leaning in with a smug expression, spoke in that exaggerated, syrupy tone reserved for talking down to someone. "Hey, buddy, can you make sure my drink is cold this time?" he said, tossing the words at Malcolm like they were nothing but coins thrown at a beggar. But Malcolm didn't flinch. He simply nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting into the faintest shadow of a professional smile. There was no flash of anger in his eyes, no stiffness in his shoulders. He moved through the crowd with the same quiet, composed patience he had honed over years of enduring this kind of treatment. There was something in his bearing that didn't quite match the role they had quietly assigned him. It wasn't arrogance, but something more subtle, something deeper. The guests, as they always did, ignored it, returning to their caviar, their casual cruelty, and their imagined superiority. Malcolm didn't mind. He had learned long ago that ignorance was an armor that others wore to protect themselves from the discomfort of seeing beyond their own narrow worldview. And as he continued through the reception, he took another slow breath, allowing the warm breeze to lift the edges of his sleeves. He caught a glimpse of himself in the mirrored surface of a serving tray. His dark eyes, his knowing smile playing at the edge of his mouth. He knew. He heard every word, every sneering laugh, every dismissive glance tossed his way. And yet, he remained steady. Because Malcolm Turner was playing a longer game than any of them could imagine. They saw a man carrying plates. What they didn't see, the part they couldn't see, was the man who had written the first check that made this entire celebration possible. Malcolm Turner wasn't there for recognition. He wasn't there for validation. He wasn't even there for a moment in the spotlight. He was there to honor a promise made years ago, to someone who had believed in him when no one else did. And as he moved silently through the crowd, every dismissive glance, every comment made in passing, only sharpened his focus. He knew they had no idea who he really was. They had no idea how their world, the one they moved in so effortlessly, was built on the foundation of a quiet legacy, his legacy. He had built his empire brick by brick, one event at a time, and he wasn't about to let a group of strangers take away the pride he felt in it. He wasn't there to impress them. He wasn't there to demand their attention. He was there to watch, to listen, and to observe how long it would take for the truth to reveal itself. And reveal itself it did. The guests, caught up in their own self-congratulation, continued with their snide remarks and offhand criticisms. They hadn't noticed how the florists, the event planners, and even the delivery men interacted with Malcolm, how they spoke to him with a respect they hadn't shown anyone else that day. They hadn't noticed how the estate's manager, an older man with salt and pepper hair, had approached Malcolm near the service entrance and nodded with a kind of quiet reverence before handing him a clipboard. Nor had they seen the subtle tension in the groom's father's posture, the way he avoided Malcolm's eyes, as though he were acutely aware that Malcolm held far more power than he ever would. But the guests? They saw none of it. They chose not to. Instead, they continued sipping champagne and boasting about their vacations to St. Tropez, their laughter ringing out, loud and brittle, as if nothing in the world could shake the illusion they had created. They clung to their familiar prejudices, comfortable in their belief that they knew exactly who Malcolm Turner was. He was the caterer, the help, the person who existed to serve them. They didn't need to look any further. But some stories aren't meant to be told with loud proclamations or dramatic announcements. Sometimes, the truth doesn't shout. Sometimes, it waits. It moves quietly, steadily, and when the time is right, it arrives with a quiet force that demands to be acknowledged. And that day, the truth was moving toward them, like the last rays of the setting sun creeping over the horizon. All the guests had to do was wait for it. The moment came as the sun dipped lower behind the towering oaks of the estate, casting long, golden shadows across the reception. The wedding ceremony had ended, and the celebration was in full swing. The air was thick with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. It was then that the father of the groom, his face flushed, either from champagne or nerves, stepped up to the microphone. The crowd, a sea of expensive suits and glittering gowns, quieted as his voice crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, clearing his throat, "if I could have just a moment." His voice wavered, not with drunkenness, but with something heavier. "Today is not just a celebration of love," he continued, his words slow, deliberate, but a celebration of legacy, of generosity, of quiet greatness. He paused for a moment, as if he were weighing the next words carefully. "There's someone here today who made all of this possible," he said, his voice thickening with emotion. The guests, caught off guard by the sudden change in tone, exchanged puzzled glances. "Who could he be talking about?" the bride's mother whispered, clutching her pearls tightly. "What is he talking about?" one of the groomsmen muttered under his breath. The father of the groom inhaled shakily, then with a deliberate, unmistakable motion, he turned and gestured directly at Malcolm Turner. The moment was electric. Time seemed to stop for just a heartbeat. The crowd froze. Whispers rippled through the air like sparks from a fire. "Him? Wait, what? The caterer?" The disbelief was palpable. The groom's father continued, his voice thickening with emotion. "Many of you may not know, but years ago, when my father, God rest his soul, Malcolm wasn't there for recognition. He wasn't there for validation. He was there to honor a promise, one he had made long ago, in the quiet of his heart, to a man who had believed in him when no one else did. The promise was the reason he had come today, the reason he moved with such quiet determination through the crowd of wealthy guests, many of whom would never know the full scope of his true worth. For Malcolm, this moment was not about the approval of others or the applause of those around him. He had come to honor the legacy of someone who had seen something in him before anyone else had. He had come because that was the right thing to do. And as he made his way through the celebration, the eyes that looked at him with contempt, the whispers of mockery, and the dismissive glances that followed him only sharpened his focus. They had no idea who he was, who he had been, or who he was becoming. But he didn't need them to know. The truth would come in its own time, like all the best stories that are revealed in their own perfect moment. The guests, drunk on champagne and their own sense of importance, didn't notice the subtle changes around them, the cracks forming in the illusion of superiority they had built so carefully over the years. They didn't notice the way the vendors, florists, and delivery men interacted with Malcolm. There was a difference in the way they spoke to him, in the way they respected him. The florists, their hands skillfully arranging the lavish floral displays that adorned the estate, greeted Malcolm with a kind of reverence that none of the guests would have expected. The estate's manager, a tall, silver-haired man who usually ran things with an iron fist, treated Malcolm with a subtle but noticeable respect, offering him a nod, a hand extended for a quiet, private exchange. Even the event planner, Eliza, usually so sharp and aloof with the other vendors, had a different tone when she addressed him. There was a measure of urgency in her voice, as though she recognized something in him that the guests could never see. But the crowd? They remained oblivious. To them, Malcolm was simply one of the caterers, a nameless face among many others in starched uniforms, his presence no more important than the polished silverware or the glittering glasses on the tables. He was there to serve them, to make sure the champagne never ran out and the hors d'oeuvres were always replenished. He was nothing more than a cog in the machine that kept the party going, a backdrop for their celebration. And in their minds, that was all he would ever be. Until the moment came. The sun, now sinking lower behind the rolling hills of the estate, bathed everything in a warm amber glow. The wedding ceremony had seamlessly transitioned into the celebration, and the air was thick with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Waiters moved through the crowd like shadows, refilling drinks and offering trays of food. The guests were distracted, too busy boasting about their vacation homes or the latest trends to pay much attention to anyone or anything outside their small circle. But Malcolm. He moved through the crowd as if he were invisible, his quiet dignity the only thing that marked him as different from the others. He wasn't there to demand attention, to stand out, or to claim the spotlight. He was there to honor his promise. And then the father of the groom took to the microphone. His face was flushed, whether from too much champagne or a deep-seated anxiety, it was hard to say, but there was an unmistakable weight in his voice as he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice crackling through the speakers, drawing the crowd's attention. A hush fell over the gathering. The laughter faltered, and the guests paused mid-conversation, their curiosity piqued. "If I could have just a moment," he continued, "today is not just a celebration of love, but a celebration of legacy, of generosity, of quiet greatness." His voice faltered, not from drunkenness, but from something deeper, something that suggested he was trying to convey a message that was far more important than any of them realized. "There's someone here today who made all of this possible," he said, pausing as if the weight of the next words required careful consideration. "A man who asked for no credit, someone who didn't want the spotlight." The guests, intrigued and confused, exchanged glances. The bride's mother, clutching her pearls nervously, turned to her husband. "Who is he talking about?" she asked in a whisper. The groom's friends leaned in closer, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "What's going on?" "This isn't part of the plan," one of them muttered. And then the father of the groom did something that would forever change the course of the evening. He turned, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, and without hesitation, he pointed directly at Malcolm. The room seemed to freeze. The sound of clinking glasses and soft murmurs evaporated into nothingness. It wasn't the sudden quiet of a room full of people coming to a realization, but the palpable shift in the atmosphere as the truth settled like a weight over the crowd. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. They were too stunned by what was happening, by the reality that was suddenly crashing into their carefully curated world. The guests looked from one another to Malcolm, trying to reconcile the image they had of him, the catering staff, the man they had so casually dismissed, with the reality that was unfolding before their eyes. "Him," someone whispered, barely able to believe their own words. "Wait, what? The caterer? No way." The father of the groom continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Many of you may not know," he said, his eyes turning back to Malcolm, who stood there quietly, his tray now lowered at his side, offering only a small, respectful nod. "But years ago, when my father, God rest his soul, believed in a young man's dream, he did so quietly, without fanfare, without expectation. That young man went on to build something extraordinary, and when we started planning this wedding, when we realized just how much it would cost, it was Malcolm Turner who stepped forward. Not because he was asked, not because he wanted recognition, but simply out of gratitude and respect for a man who believed in him when no one else did." The room held its breath. The words hung in the air like an electric charge, buzzing in the ears of everyone who had heard them. The guests, caught between disbelief and embarrassment, stared at Malcolm, trying to understand how this could be possible. How had the man they had mocked, the man they had laughed at, become the one responsible for making this entire celebration happen? How had the caterer, the servant, become the man who had made their world possible? For a long moment, Malcolm stood still, his face a picture of quiet dignity. His tray now hung at his side, forgotten in the face of the truth that had just been revealed. He didn't gloat. He didn't stand tall and demand their respect. He didn't even acknowledge the whispered apologies from some of the more brash guests who had once made fun of him. He simply nodded, small, respectful, and composed, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth they could no longer deny. He hadn't needed to brag. He hadn't needed to announce himself. He had simply come to honor a debt of gratitude. He had come because of a promise he had made, and that promise had brought him to this moment, standing silently among the crowd that had once thought so little of him. And now, as the reality of who Malcolm Turner was began to settle over the guests like a heavy fog, the laughter that had filled the air earlier that evening was swallowed by an uncomfortable silence. The laughter that had been aimed at him, the mockery, the dismissive jokes, had died in an instant, leaving only the weight of realization behind. The room stood still. Some guests couldn't bear to look at Malcolm, their faces burning with shame as they remembered their cruel comments, their casual cruelty. Others stared at their half-finished plates, as though they could somehow hide from the truth by avoiding eye contact. A few guests, braver than the rest, approached him with awkward smiles, as if an apology could somehow undo the condescension they had shown him earlier. "I had no idea," one man stammered, extending a hand as though trying to erase hours of mockery with a single gesture. "You should have said something," another murmured weakly, still trapped in the outdated belief that true success and status required constant self-promotion. Malcolm simply smiled politely, a soft, measured smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No need," he said, his voice calm, composed, but carrying the weight of years of experience. He didn't need their validation. He didn't need their applause. He had never needed to announce his worth. His worth had always been clear. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. As the evening drew to a close, the guests, once so confident in their superiority, began to understand what had just happened. Malcolm wasn't just part of the background. He was the reason the stage even existed beneath their feet. His empire, quietly built over years of hard work, was the foundation that had allowed their lavish wedding to happen at all. He had never sought the limelight. He had never demanded recognition. He had simply moved through the celebration, offering his service with quiet dignity, knowing that the truth would one day be revealed. And now, as the last of the champagne was poured and the final notes of music drifted into the evening air, the guests were left to reflect on the lesson they had learned that night. The lesson of quiet greatness, of how true worth is never about who you impress when everyone is watching, but who you respect when no one is looking.